Before the terms transgender or gender fluid appeared in human dictionaries centuries ago, there was a man who lived with the raw truth of his soul right in the heart of conservative Europe. In the 17th century, the world was absolutely dualistic, male and female. That boundary was an address. But the man who was stepping up to conquer this, François-Timoléon de Choisy, refused to fight for distinction, a father of God, a diplomat of the king, yet he declared, "I believe my soul belongs to the world of women." This is not a joke of history. This is the story of a transgender man who redefined himself before the world had words to name him. How could a female soul trapped in a male body survive, even ascend, right under the noses of the Inquisition and the Sun King? Welcome to the extraordinary life of Abbé de Choisy. To truly understand the phenomenon of Choisy, we must first take a sledgehammer to the romanticized veneer of the 17th century and examine the strange cold mechanics of the world he was born into. We often think of the reign of Louis XIV as a monolith of iron-fisted discipline. The church was omnipotent. The laws against sodomy and any form of moral deviation were, on paper, draconian, often punishable by fire. To deviate visibly from the norm was usually to invite swift destruction. Yet beneath the surface of powdered wigs and rigid protocols, the French court was a place of rampant, almost feverish contradiction. It was a society suffocating under its own rules, desperate for any form of release. In this high-stakes atmosphere, refined eccentricity became a form of currency. If you were merely competent and obedient, you were invisible, a piece of furniture in the king's great halls. But if you were fascinating, if you provided a spectacle that amused the monarch without threatening his authority, you were granted a strange license to exist outside the boundaries of normal law. And surprisingly, the ultimate precedent for Choisy's behavior came from the very apex of the pyramid, the king's own family. Louis XIV had a younger brother, Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, known simply to the world as Monsieur. Monsieur was the second most powerful man in France, a capable soldier when allowed onto the field. Yet Monsieur was also openly, flamboyantly effeminate. He detested the rough clothes of warfare, preferring instead to be covered in ribbons, jewels, and expensive scents. He wore high heels not just for status, as the king did, but to emulate a feminine gait. He was often referred to playfully by the court, and sometimes cruelly by his enemies, as the little girl. This was not merely a personal quirk of the prince. It was a piece of calculated political engineering born from the trauma of the French crown. France had a bloody history of younger brothers, ambitious masculine warrior princes, trying to overthrow the king. The court remembered the civil wars of the Fronde. The prime minister during Louis's youth, the crafty Italian Cardinal Mazarin, had actively encouraged Philippe's inclinations toward the feminine. The strategy was cynical and brilliant. Make the younger brother obsessed with fabrics, jewelry, and male favorites rather than armies and political maneuvering, and the crown remained secure. It was in this specific atmosphere that François-Timoléon de Choisy was born in 1644. The wearing of silk layers, lace, and diamonds was standard for noblemen as a display of wealth. But to cross the invisible line, to adopt the soul of the feminine, to prefer the curtsy to the bow, was forbidden to everyone except those who held the king's absolute favor or those who modeled themselves after the king's brother. Choisy's destiny was forged before he could speak, not by his own hand, but by that of his mother, Madame de Choisy. She was a woman of the court par excellence, fiercely intelligent, terrifyingly ambitious, and acutely aware of the shifting sands of royal favor. She was a close confidant of the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, and she observed the strategic effeminization of the young Prince Philippe with a calculator's eye. Seeing an opportunity to ingratiate her family permanently with the royals, Madame de Choisy made a chilling decision. She would turn her own youngest son into a mirror for the young prince. Francois would not just be a playmate, he would be a validation of Philippe's manufactured nature. From infancy, Francois was dressed not in the breeches and miniature doublets of a future nobleman, but in the complete attire of a high-born girl. Stiffened corsets to mold the torso, flowing silk gowns richly embroidered with gold thread, and elaborate skirts that required a different kind of movement entirely. In his memoirs, written decades later with a startling candor, Choisy recounted those formative years. "I was dressed as a girl every time little monsieur came to visit," he wrote. "He had me dressed up, and he was dressed up too. We played at toilets, at being grande dame." But Madame de Choisy's design went far beyond mere dress-up games 3 afternoons a week. It was a systematic reshaping of a human being. She tightly laced his growing waist every single day to create a permanent feminine silhouette, warping the soft cartilage of his ribs. She rubbed his skin faithfully with restrictive, foul-smelling concoctions made of strange herbs and chemicals, intended to retard the growth of facial hair and keep his complexion porcelain smooth. She trained him in the arts of womanhood. While his peers were learning calligraphy and the basics of swordsmanship, Francois was mastering the subtle language of the fan, the precise depth of a curtsy appropriate for a duchess versus a princess of the blood, and the art of applying rouge to create an illusion of delicate emotion. By the time he was 18 years old, the artifice had calcified into nature. The mask had become the face. What makes Choisy's narrative so singularly compelling, however, is his reaction to this intense conditioning. A modern perspective might expect a story of trauma and deep resentment toward the mother who denied him his birthright of masculinity. Yet Choisy's own accounts reveal the opposite. He did not resent the imposition, he adored it. His memoirs describe a genuine tactile delight in the world he was forced into. He speaks of the inexpressible pleasure of the transformation. "I believe I truly belong to the world of silk and sparkle," he confessed to his parchment. He loved the sensual feel of soft velvet against his skin, vastly preferring it to the scratchy wools of men's attire. He delighted in the heavy swinging weight of gold earrings and the way diamonds caught the candlelight when he turned his head. Most importantly, he became addicted to the social reflection he saw in the eyes of others. When dressed as a boy, he was merely another unremarkable young nobleman. When dressed as a beautiful young woman, he was the center of attention. He was showered with compliments on his complexion, his grace, his wit. He realized very early on that his soul was fluid. He was biologically male, and as his later life would prove abundantly, he was romantically drawn to women. Yet his spirit, his preferred presentation to the world, the vessel in which he felt most authentic, felt jagged and uncomfortable in male clothing, but settled and serene when wrapped in taffeta. He was a pioneer of a state of being that had no name in the 17th century. He was not trying to be a woman in a biological sense. He was trying to embody an aesthetic ideal that he found more comfortable than the warrior masculinity demanded of his gender. As he crossed the threshold from adolescence into adulthood, the practical realities of his biological reality could not be entirely ignored by his family. A career had to be chosen. The military was obviously out of the question. A purely political life would require a masculine presentation he was unwilling to adopt full-time. And so the church was chosen. It was a common path for younger sons of the nobility. He took holy orders, becoming an abbé. This was a brilliant tactical move. It provided him with a steady, significant income independent of his family. It gave him an undeniable social status that commanded respect. And cruelly, ironically, the long, flowing robes of the priesthood were far closer to the gowns he loved than the severe breeches of a layman. Yet the vows of the priesthood, which should have acted as a restraint on his eccentricities, instead became a shield. He had the security of the cloth, but the desires of the silk soul were becoming stronger, demanding more than just occasional appearances at court mass balls. The stage of Versailles was too exposed for the full expression of what he needed to explore. He needed a backstage, and so began the hidden years, a chapter of his life often glossed over by historians who focus only on the glittering court. In his mid-20s, the Abbé de Choisy made a radical decision. He would not just dress up, he would disappear into the persona he had cultivated. He rented a large, discreet house in the Faubourg Saint-Marceau, a respectable suburb of Paris, far enough from the prying eyes of the Louvre and Versailles to allow for anonymity. He furnished it with opulent femininity, and there the Abbé de Choisy ceased to exist for days, sometimes weeks at a time. In his place lived the Comtesse de Bar. This was no longer a game played for the amusement of Monsieur. This was a full-time immersion into the life of a noblewoman. He spent hours every morning at his toilette, assisted by maids who were either heavily bribed or entirely duped, applying the white lead makeup, placing the beauty patches made of black silk to highlight his best features, and being laced into gowns of increasing extravagance. He did not hide indoors. The Comtesse became a fixture of the local society. He attended the local parish church, not in the sanctuary with the priests, but in the pews with the high-born ladies. He recounts with almost trembling glee the day the local vicar, completely deceived by the quality of his jewels and the arrogance of his bearing, offered him the consecrated bread before all the other women in the congregation, a supreme sign of social respect for a noble lady. He hosted salons in his home, inviting local gentry and unknowing young noblewomen to drink chocolate and discuss literature. He lived on a knife's edge, a thrilling high-wire act where one slip of the voice, one overly masculine gesture, could bring his entire constructed world crashing down in scandal and violence. It was during this period that the complexity of his inner desires revealed itself most starkly. The Comtesse de Bar was not a nun. Choisy used his flawless disguise to engage in a series of complex theatrical seductions that bordered on psychological predatory behavior. He found that being perceived as a woman gave him unprecedented access to the private worlds of other women. He could enter their bedchambers while they dressed without suspicion. He could become their confidant, listening to their secrets about men, their hopes for marriage, their hidden desires. He would befriend young, beautiful heiresses, gaining their absolute trust as an older, wiser female friend. The thrill for Choisy was the deception itself, the dangerous game played on the precipice of morality. He would draw them in, make them love the Comtesse, and then in a moment of carefully calculated drama, reveal the truth of his gender, often leading to a seduction that was half shock, half inevitable surrender. But this life of dual identities was unsustainable. It was hemorrhaging money. His addiction was not just to silk, but to the green felt of the gambling tables. To maintain the illusion of the wealthy Comtesse, he played high-stakes cards almost every night, losing vast sums of borrowed money with the same reckless abandon with which he wore his diamonds. By 1683, the house of cards began to teeter. He was spiritually exhausted and financially ruined. The profound stress of living a lie, combined with the dissipations of his lifestyle, broke his health. He was struck down by a severe, unidentified illness that brought him to the very brink of death. For days, he lay in a fevered delirium. The doctors bled him, priests hovered over him administering last rites, and the scent of death filled his perfumed boudoir. In that era, illness was rarely just biology. It was a message from God. As he gazed into the abyss, terrifying visions of hellfire and eternal damnation for his unnatural life consumed him. The silk gowns hanging in his wardrobe suddenly looked like shrouds. The diamonds looked like burning coals. In a paroxysm of terror, he made a solemn vow to heaven. If he was spared, if he was allowed to live, he would renounce the Comtesse de Barras forever. He would burn the wigs, sell the jewels for the poor, and live authentically as a sober priest of God. The fever broke. He survived. And for a few short months, the penitent Abbé de Choisy walked the streets of Paris in a plain black cassock, his face scrubbed clean of paint, trying desperately to shove the silk soul back into a dark box. But a lifetime of conditioning is not undone by a single fever dream. The nature that his mother had engineered and that he had embraced was too strong. The itch of plain wool against his skin was unbearable. The invisibility of being merely a man was a torture he hadn't anticipated. He was alive, yes, but he felt colorless. Fate, however, has a strange sense of humor. Just as his resolve was crumbling, just as he was eyeing a new pair of emerald earrings in a jeweler's window, an opportunity arose that would allow him to fuse his duty to the king, his religious vocation, and his desperate need for spectacular self-expression into one incredible adventure. This opportunity, however, would not lead him back to the familiar comforts of the French court, but rather cast him into the most alien environment imaginable for a creature of such refined habits. It would require him to trade the safety of the confessional for the perils of the ocean, and the known rules of Paris for the exotic mysteries of the East. For the penitent abbé, the test of his resolve and the ultimate test of his wardrobe was about to begin on a global stage. If the streets of Paris and the salons of the Faubourg Saint-Marceau had been a stage for the Abbé de Choisy's private theater, the year 1685 offered him a theater of global proportions. The setting was no longer the intimate, candlelit boudoirs of the French nobility, but the vast, terrifying expanse of the open ocean and the exotic, sun-drenched kingdom of Siam. The opportunity that saved him from his post-illness melancholy was a diplomatic mission of unprecedented ambition. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, had turned his gaze east. He sought to extend the influence of France and the Catholic Church into Asia, specifically targeting the wealthy and powerful kingdom of Siam, modern-day Thailand. The goal was nothing short of audacious: to convert the Siamese king, Narai the Great, to Catholicism, and thereby turn the entire nation into a French satellite. To lead this mission, the king appointed the Chevalier de Chaumont, a rigid, pious, and utterly humorless military man. But Louis XIV, with his keen understanding of human chemistry, knew that a mission of conversion required more than just stiff-necked authority. It required charm. It required a seducer's tongue. It required a man who could speak of God with the same passion he spoke of beauty. And so, the king pointed a gloved finger at the penitent, recovering gambler, François-Timoléon de Choisy. He was to accompany the mission as a co-ambassador, tasked specifically with the spiritual conversion of the Siamese king. The irony was delicious. A man who had spent the last decade living as a woman, seducing heiresses and bankrupting himself at cards, was now the chosen vessel of the Holy Spirit. But for Choisy, this was not just a job. It was an escape. It was a way to flee his creditors, his reputation, and the confusing, suffocating temptations of Paris. The preparations for the voyage revealed the true state of Choisy's soul. Most men preparing for a 6-month voyage into the treacherous unknown packed for survival. They brought muskets, dried meats, navigational charts, and heavy woolens. Choisy packed for a gala. His luggage was a source of endless fascination and ridicule for the crew. Into the hold of the Oiseau, the flagship of the fleet, went trunk after trunk. But they were not filled with Bibles or theological treatises. They were filled with fine linens, perfumes, powders, mirrors, and, hidden beneath layers of priestly vestments, a dazzling array of women's accessories. He justified this to himself and others as gifts for the Siamese court, or necessary items to maintain the dignity of a French ambassador. But the truth was simpler. He was terrified of becoming ugly. I am taking everything necessary to ensure I do not look like a savage when I arrive, he told a friend before departure. To Choisy, the loss of civilization was more terrifying than the risk of drowning. The voyage to Siam was a nightmare that lasted half a year. The ships of the 17th century were floating coffins, cramped, filthy, and rife with disease. Scurvy rotted the gums of the sailors. Dysentery turned the lower decks into a latrine. Storms off the Cape of Good Hope tossed the Oiseau like a child's toy, threatening to snap the masts and send the king's ambitions to the bottom of the ocean. While the Chevalier de Chaumont prayed grimly in his cabin and the sailors cursed the wind, Choisy created a bubble of surreal refinement. He transformed his tiny cabin into a floating sanctuary of the Faubourg Saint-Marceau. He hung tapestries to cover the damp wood. He burned incense to mask the stench of bilge water and unwashed bodies. And it was here, in the middle of the Atlantic, suspended between his old life and his new mission, that he began to write. Not diplomatic dispatches, but his memoirs. The Memoires de l'Abbé de Choisy, habillé en femme, were born not in a Parisian salon, but on a rolling ship, written by a man desperate to capture the joy of his past life before he committed himself fully to God. He wrote of his days as the Comtesse with a nostalgic ache. He detailed the feel of the corsets, the thrill of the deception, the inexpressible pleasure of being admired. It was a strange penance, confessing his sins by reliving them with exquisite, loving detail. Yet he did not neglect his duties. In a display of his characteristic soul flexibility, he would put down his pen, wipe the tears of nostalgia from his eyes, and emerge onto the deck to teach catechism to the rough sailors. He was popular with the crew. He was not a distant, scolding cleric. He was kind. He listened to their fears. He told them stories. He possessed a warmth that the rigid Chaumont lacked entirely. The sailors didn't care about his effeminate gestures or his smelling salts. They cared that he treated them like human beings. When the French fleet finally navigated the Menam River and arrived at the capital of Ayutthaya in late 1685, they were greeted with a spectacle that rivaled Versailles. Siam was a kingdom of gold spires, floating markets, and a court culture of immense sophistication. For the Chevalier de Chaumont, the Siamese court was a pagan frustration. The etiquette was foreign. The requirement to prostrate oneself before the king was an insult to his French pride. He lumbered through the diplomatic engagements like a bull in a china shop, demanding conversion and offering little in return. Choisy, however, blossomed. The Siamese court was a world that valued nuance, soft speech, and rigorous, almost dance-like etiquette. It was a culture where beauty was power. The silk soul of the Abbé recognized a kindred spirit in this tropical kingdom. He was fascinated by the Siamese nobility. He admired their silks, lighter and more breathable than the heavy French brocades. He marveled at their jewelry, and crucially, he understood their diplomatic language. He realized that you could not demand the king of Siam to convert. You had to seduce him. It was in Siam that a pivotal and often misunderstood event took place. To negotiate effectively with the king on religious matters, Choisy needed the full authority of the priesthood. He had been an abbé, a tonsured cleric, for years, but he had never taken the final irreversible vows of the priesthood that allowed him to say Mass. There, in the sweltering heat of the tropics, thousands of miles from the judgment of Paris, François-Timoléon de Choisy was fully ordained. He stood before the altar, sweat trickling down his back under the heavy vestments, and swore his life to Christ. Was it a cynical political move to gain rank? Or was it a genuine attempt to wash away the Comtesse de Bars once and for all? The evidence suggests a chaotic mixture of both. He cried during the ceremony. He wrote of feeling a great weight descend upon him. He truly wanted to be good. He truly wanted to serve. But even as he rose a full priest, he was planning the layout of the mirrors in his ambassadorial residence. His approach to the conversion of the Siamese was unique. He didn't preach hellfire. He preached beauty. He spoke of the grandeur of the Catholic Mass, the glittering gold of the monstrance, the sweet music of the hymns. He tried to sell Catholicism as an aesthetic upgrade. He befriended Constance Falcon, the Greek adventurer who had become the king of Siam's most trusted counselor. Falcon was a shark, a man of immense cunning, but he found himself charmed by this strange, soft French priest who seemed more interested in the cut of the king's robes than the details of trade tariffs. Choisy failed in his primary mission. King Narai was polite, intelligent, and utterly unmoved by the theological arguments. He had no intention of abandoning the Buddhism of his ancestors. He played the French along to gain their military support against the Dutch, but he would not give them his soul. Chaumont was furious. He felt humiliated, but Choisy saw the situation differently. He saw the beauty of the attempt. He spent his days collecting crate after crate of Siamese porcelain, lacquerware, and most importantly, fabrics. He bought silks of a quality unknown in Europe, shimmering, iridescent, impossibly light. He told himself they were for the church. They were for vestments. They were for altar cloths. But as he ran his hands over the bolts of fabric, the dormant Comtesse de Bar whispered in the back of his mind. "Imagine," she said, "what a gown this would make." The return journey in 1686 was harrowing. The ships were battered, the crew was decimated by disease, and the mood was grim with the failure of the conversion. But Choisy returned to France not as a failure, but as a celebrity. He had survived the ends of the earth. He had dined with Eastern potentates. He had published a journal of his voyage that became an instant bestseller in Paris. He was hailed as a hero of the faith and a daring explorer. He arrived at Versailles, bowing before Louis XIV, presenting the king with gifts from the king of Siam. He was at the height of his male career. He was a respected priest, a successful author, and a diplomat who had flown the French flag in the Golden East. The king granted him a pension. The church offered him praise. He had done it. He had successfully performed the role of a man, a hero, and a priest. He had suppressed his nature for 2 long years. But as he unpacked his trunks in his Paris apartments, shaking the dust of the voyage from the reams of Siamese silk, the silence of the room felt heavy. The adrenaline of the mission was gone. The audience of the court had turned its eyes to the next spectacle, and François-Timoléon de Choisy was left alone with his reflection. He looked at the black cassock of the priest, Stained with the salt of the sea, he looked at the vibrant, flowing silk from Siam. He was 42 years old. He had served his king. He had served his God. And now a quiet, insidious thought began to take root in the fertile soil of his boredom. Haven't I earned a little reward? The silence of his apartment did not last long. As the months passed, the temptation to unlock those trunks transformed from a whisper into a roar. Choisy realized that living a half-life in the shadows, or suppressing his nature entirely for the sake of a pious reputation, was a form of spiritual suicide he could no longer endure. The silk soul demanded to be seen, not just in the privacy of a mirror, but in the full, unforgiving light of society. And so he made the audacious choice to stop hiding and to step into the most dangerous spotlight in Europe. The year is 1689. France is changing. The golden, hedonistic sun of Louis XIV's early reign is beginning to set, replaced by a twilight of piety, endless warfare, and financial exhaustion. The king, once the voracious lover of many mistresses, has secretly married Madame de Maintenon, a woman of severe Catholic virtue who banned comedy and imposed a stifling moral seriousness upon Versailles. The court, once a playground, has become a cathedral, and yet it is precisely against this gray backdrop that the Abbé de Choisy chose to shine brighter than ever before. Upon his return from Siam, many expected Choisy to retire into a quiet, respectable ecclesiastical life. He had his pension. He had his reputation as a diplomat. The logical path was to fade into the woodwork of the church hierarchy, perhaps angling for a bishopric in a sleepy province. But François-Timoléon de Choisy had tasted the drabness of purely masculine existence during his years of travel, and he found it utterly indigestible. He made a decision that in any other era or under any other monarch would have seen him burned at the stake or locked in a madhouse. He decided to merge his two selves. There would be no more Comtesse de Barre hiding in the suburbs. There would simply be the Abbé de Choisy, the priest courtier, living openly, defiantly, and joyfully in women's clothes at the very center of power. He purchased a magnificent residence on the Rue du Bac in Paris, bordering the fashionable Faubourg Saint-Germain. But this was not a hermit's cave. It was a stage. Choisy began to host the most sought-after dinners in the capital. The guests were not fringe deviants or libertines. They were cardinals, dukes, ambassadors, and the intellectual elite of the Académie Française. They came to eat his exquisite food, to listen to his brilliant conversation, and to ignore the elephant in the room, that their host was a 60-year-old priest wearing a décolleté gown of embroidered taffeta, a diamond choker, and beauty patches strategically placed to hide the wrinkles of age. The social contract at the Hôtel de Choisy was fascinatingly complex. Everyone knew he was a man. Everyone knew he was a priest. Yet, by tacit agreement, he was addressed with feminine pronouns when in grand habit. He was complimented on his toilette. The guests participated in his delusion because the delusion was charming, harmless, and performed with such absolute commitment that it commanded respect. One contemporary, the acid-tongued memoirist Saint-Simon, who usually destroyed reputations for sport, was strangely gentle with Choisy. He noted the eccentricity but focused on Choisy's agreeable spirit and his lack of malice. In a court filled with backstabbing vipers, Choisy was a colorful butterfly, flighty perhaps, but incapable of stinging. The key to his survival, however, remained his connection to the royal family. Philippe I, the Duke of Orléans, Monsieur, was now an aging man himself, but his love for the feminine had never waned. As the court of Louis XIV became more dour under Madame de Maintenon, the court of Monsieur at the Palais Royal, and the Château de Saint-Cloud became the last refuge of the old gay flamboyant style. Choisy became a fixture here. He was no longer the little girl playmate of Philippe's youth, but a sort of eccentric aunt figure. The two old men would spend hours discussing fabrics, the latest fashions from Milan, and the tragedy of aging skin. There is a touching, almost surreal account of a ball held at Monsieur's residence during this period. The king himself was present, looking grave and majestic. Monsieur was covered in emeralds, and there, dancing the minuet, was the Abbé de Choisy. He was wearing a gown of silver moiré, a towering wig known as a fontange, and a train carried by a page boy. When he approached the king, the room held its breath. Louis XIV, the man who had just revoked the Edict of Nantes and expelled the Protestants in a fit of religious zeal, looked at the cross-dressing priest. The king did not frown. He did not order the Swiss guard to arrest him. He bowed. He reportedly asked the abbé, "You are looking particularly fresh this evening, abbé. That shade of silver suits you." It was the ultimate sanction. The king's bow was a shield that no bishop or moralist could pierce. Louis XIV understood that Choisy was a creature of the monarchy's own making, a living relic of the days when the king and his brother were young. To destroy Choisy would be to destroy a piece of the family history. While his body was wrapped in silk, his mind was sharper than ever. This period marks the height of Choisy's intellectual output, and the contradiction here is the most profound of his life. While living openly as a woman, Choisy sat at his desk to write the Histoire de l'Église. This was not a satire. It was a massive, multi-volume, deeply researched and orthodox history of Christianity. It was a work of serious scholarship praised by the Pope and the French clergy. Imagine the scene. The Abbé de Choisy sitting in his library. He is wearing a lace negligee and a nightcap tied with pink ribbons. His face is painted, and with a quill pen, he is writing about the martyrdom of the saints, the councils of Nicaea, and the moral imperatives of the faith. He saw no contradiction. To Choisy, his soul was compartmentalized. His intellect belonged to God and the church. His body belonged to the aesthetic world. He argued, perhaps only to himself, that as long as his dogma was pure, his dress was irrelevant. God looks at the heart, he might have reasoned, and my heart is full of faith. My wardrobe is merely a matter of decoration. He also wrote his memoirs during this time, though they would be kept secret until after his death. In these pages, the tone shifts from the serious historian to the giddy confessor. He writes about the little republic of his neighborhood, a circle of women he befriended. He became the mother superior of a group of local girls, teaching them how to dress, how to act, and living vicariously through their youth. However, we must not romanticize this period entirely. There was a desperate, almost pathetic quality to Choisy's later years. The soul flexibility was beginning to stretch thin over the reality of a decaying body. He was terrified of old age. In the 17th century, a woman's value was almost entirely tethered to her youth and beauty. A man could age with dignity. He acquired gravitas. A woman who aged was often an object of ridicule. By living as a woman, Choisy voluntarily took on the curse of female aging. He spent fortune and hours on remedies. He used lead-based creams to hide his wrinkles, slowly poisoning himself in the process. He wore corsets so tight they caused him fainting spells, all to maintain the waistline of a girl of 20. There were whispers, too, of a more predatory nature to his little republic. Some historians suggest that his interest in the young girls of the neighborhood was not entirely maternal. He would often have them dress in his clothes, styling them like dolls. Was he grooming them? Or was he simply trying to clone himself to create younger versions of the Comtesse so that the fantasy could live on when his own body failed? The text remains ambiguous, but the undertone is unsettling. It suggests a man frantically trying to hold on to a dream that was slipping through his arthritic fingers. He was a vampire of youth, feeding not on blood, but on the vicarious thrill of seeing his own desires reflected in the smooth faces of others. How did he justify this to his confessor? We know that Choisy was a believer. He went to Mass, he prayed. How did he reconcile his lifestyle with Leviticus? It appears Choisy adopted a unique personal theology. He viewed his cross-dressing not as a sin of lust, which was a mortal sin, but as a sin of vanity. Vanity was a venial sin, a minor stumble on the road to salvation, easily wiped away by prayer and good works. By framing his life as a weakness for finery, rather than a carnal deviance, he navigated the dangerous waters of the Inquisition. He was just a vain old priest who liked soft things. It was a brilliant, life-saving rationalization. It allowed the church to roll its eyes rather than light the pyre. As the 17th century bled into the 18th, the atmosphere at Versailles grew even darker. Famine struck France. The War of the Spanish Succession drained the treasury. Death began to stalk the royal family. In 1701, the unthinkable happened. Monsieur, the Duke of Orleans, Choisy's lifelong protector and mirror, died of a stroke after a shouting match with the king. For Choisy, this was a catastrophe. Monsieur was the anchor of his existence. With Philippe gone, the era of tolerated eccentricity was effectively over. The new generation of courtiers was more cynical, less forgiving of the old whimsies. Choisy was now an old man in a changing world. The priest in the gown was no longer a charming novelty. He was becoming a grotesque relic. The protective bubble was thinning. The king was dying. The century was dying. And François-Timoléon de Choisy, the man who had turned his life into a piece of performance art, was about to face the one audience that never applauds, the silence of irrelevance. The silence of his later years was compounded by a cruelty that no amount of charm could deflect. The relentless march of time. The famous mirrors of Versailles, designed to reflect the Sun King's glory, began to tell Choisy a harsh story. By 1710, in his mid-60s, the silk soul that had sustained him was trapped in a crumbling body. The tragedy of the Abbé de Choisy wasn't that he dressed as a woman, but that he dressed as a young beauty, yet had the misfortune to live a long life. Every wrinkle and gray hair was a betrayal of the illusion he had so carefully crafted. There is something profoundly melancholic about the image of the aging abbé sitting at his vanity table in the Rue du Bac. The ritual of dressing, which had once been a source of inexpressible pleasure, had become a desperate construction project. He did not abandon his gowns. If anything, he clung to them with a tighter grip. He wore corsets reinforced with steel to force his thickening waist into the silhouette of a girl. He applied thicker layers of white lead paint to fill the crevices of his face. He began to wear high collars and elaborate lace chokers to hide the sagging skin of his neck. The Comtesse was no longer a fresh-faced debutante. She was becoming a caricature. The whispers at court, once amused, turned pitiful. The good abbé, one observer noted, looks like a wax doll left too long near the fire. Yet, Choisy refused to surrender. He possessed a terrifying kind of courage, the courage of the narcissist who refuses to accept the verdict of nature. He continued to attend the opera. He continued to host his dinners. He acted as if nothing had changed, forcing the world to play along with his delusion through the sheer force of his dignity. It was during these twilight years, when the physical act of being the Comtesse became painful, that Choisy retreated into the world of memory. He realized that his body would not last, but his words could. He had spent years writing respectable histories of the church and the king. But now, in the quiet of his library, he focused on his true legacy, the memoirs. This manuscript was his confession and his vindication. He wrote with a frantic energy, trying to capture the sensation of silk, the smell of the perfumes, the adrenaline of the seductions. He wanted to explain himself to a future he would never see. "I have been told," he wrote, "that I have a feminine soul. I do not know if souls have a gender, but I know that mine is only at peace when I am adorned." He knew he could not publish this while he was alive. It would destroy his standing as a serious historian and a priest. It would be a scandal that even the king could not ignore. So, he wrote for the grave. He entrusted the manuscript to close friends with instructions to publish it only after he was safely in the ground. It was a time capsule of soul flexibility, a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean of time, hoping that a more understanding generation would one day find it. Then, in 1715, the sky fell. Louis XIV died. The death of the king was not just a political event, it was the end of the universe as Choisy knew it. Louis XIV had been the sun around which Choisy's entire life orbited. The king's tacit tolerance, his amused bow at the ball, his protection, this was the gravity that held Choisy's world together. With the king gone, the regency began. The new ruler, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, was a libertine, a man of wild excesses and orgies. One might think this would be good for Choisy, but it was not. The regency was cynical. It lacked the refined ceremonial eccentricity of the old court. It was a time of brutal mockery and hard edges. Choisy, now 71 years old, was a relic. He was a piece of walking furniture from a bygone era. The young rakes of the Regency looked at the old priest in the dress not with wonder, but with confusion. "Why," they seemed to ask, "is that old man wearing a grandmother's gown?" Sensing the cold wind of irrelevance, Choisy began a final transformation. He could no longer be the beauty. He could no longer be the seductress. So, he became the matriarch. He leaned into his role as a spiritual advisor. He spent more time at the Académie Française, where he was now the dean, the oldest living member. He attended meetings dressed in a strange hybrid of ecclesiastical and feminine attire, a long black cassock made of the finest, softest silk, cut to flow like a dress, accessorized with modest but unmistakable jewelry. He became a beloved figure of fun and wisdom. He was the good abbé, the eccentric uncle of France. He told stories of the old days, of the great century, of the balls where he outshone the duchesses. He became a living historian, a bridge to a past that was rapidly fading into myth. But internally, the struggle continued. His letters from this period reveal a man wrestling with God. He was terrified of death. He was terrified of judgment. He had spent his life playing a role. Would God recognize the actor beneath the costume? He increased his charitable works. He gave money to the poor. He prayed fervently, but he never, not once, renounced his nature. He did not burn the dresses. He did not sell the diamonds. There is a profound stubbornness in this. He seemed to be making a bet with the Almighty. Take me as I am, or not at all. He believed perhaps that God had made him this way, a mistake of nature as he called it, and therefore God was responsible for the result. As the 1720s arrived, Choisy's health began to fail completely. The body that had been corseted and painted for 80 years was exhausted. He could barely walk. His eyesight was failing, making it difficult to write or to see his own reflection in the mirror. The world outside his windows was moving on. The Enlightenment was beginning to stir. Men like Voltaire were starting to ask dangerous questions about religion and society. The era of the divine right of kings and the priest in the gown was ending. Choisy lay in his bed on the Rue du Bac, surrounded by his fading tapestries and his dusty bottles of perfume. The stage was dark. The audience had gone home. The curtain was about to fall. But François-Timoléon de Choisy had one final surprise left. He had one last performance to give, the performance of a good death, and he was determined to die exactly as he had lived, entirely on his own terms, with a touch of inexplicable grace. The final curtain call, however, would not be played out in front of a cheering crowd, but in the hushed intimacy of a dying chamber. As the days shortened and the shadows lengthened in the Rue du Bac, the performance stripped itself down to its absolute essentials. There were no more balls to attend, no more witty repartees to exchange with the king. There was only the man, his God, and the weight of 80 extraordinary years pressing down upon a chest that had finally stopped fighting the corset. October in Paris is often gray, a prelude to the long winter. On the 2nd of October, 1724, the light in the bedroom on the Rue du Bac was dim. The air was still, heavy with the scent of beeswax candles, and the faint lingering aroma of old lavender. François-Timoléon de Choisy was 80 years old. To reach 80 in the early 18th century was a feat of endurance in itself. To reach it after a life of such intense duality, of such physical and psychological strain, was a miracle. The body that lay beneath the heavy velvet counterpane was frail, a withered husk of the Comtesse, who had once turned heads at the opera. The famous diamonds were locked away in a box. The corsets were gone, replaced by the loose, forgiving linen of a sick bed. But the mind, that brilliant, fluid, uncontainable mind, was lucid to the end. As the end approached, the church, which had hovered over his entire life like a stern father, came to claim its son. Priests arrived to administer the last rites. This was the moment of ultimate danger for Choisy. In the Catholic theology of the time, a bad death, dying without fully repenting of one's sins, meant eternal damnation. The question hung in the silence of the room. Would he renounce it all? Would he, in his final breath, declare his life a mistake? Would he beg forgiveness for the silk, the earrings, the deception? We do not have a transcript of his final confession. That remains sealed by the sacrament. But we know his public actions. He did not order his memoirs to be burned. He did not issue a public retraction of his past. He died with a certain serene confidence, a belief that the God who made the stars also made the strange, shimmering soul of the Abbé de Choisy. He passed away quietly, slipping from one world to the next without a struggle. The priest in the gown was gone. The funeral was respectable. He was buried as a priest, as a member of the Académie Française, as a historian of the church. The establishment tried to bury the Comtesse along with the body, hoping that the eccentricity would be forgotten, treated as a senile quirk of a brilliant man. They failed. Choisy had laid a trap for history. He had entrusted his scandalous memoirs to friends who ensured they survived. When the Mémoires de l'Abbé de Choisy, habillé en femme, finally circulated, they exploded like a bomb in the polite society of the Enlightenment. Readers were shocked. They expected a pious reflection or a dry diplomatic journal. Instead, they found a love letter to cross-dressing. They found a man writing with joy, with humor, and with a startling lack of shame about the pleasure of femininity. The church was embarrassed, critics were baffled, but the public was fascinated. The memoirs ensured that Choisy would not be remembered merely as the author of a dusty history of the church. he would be remembered as the most singular, courageous, and baffling figure of the Grand Siècle. So, what is the final verdict on the priest in silk gowns? For centuries, he was treated as a footnote, a curiosity, a medical case to be analyzed by psychologists. But looking back from our vantage point, the Abbé de Choisy appears as something far more profound. He was a prisoner of his time, yet he found a way to be free. He lived in a society of absolute rules, rules about gender, rules about class, rules about religion. And he broke them all, not with violence, but with a smile. He did not storm the Bastille. He simply put on a dress and walked through the front door of Versailles. His life proves that the concept of soul flexibility, the ability of the human spirit to transcend the binary categories of society, is not a modern invention. It is as old as humanity itself. It existed in the shadow of the Sun King's throne. It existed in the pulpit of the Catholic Church. Choisy showed that authority is often a performance. If a man in a dress can be a respected diplomat and a pious priest, then the rigid lines we draw between male and female, sacred and profane, are not as solid as we think. They are permeable. They are fragile. Ultimately, his very existence was his greatest sermon. He preached a gospel not of conformity, but of authenticity. He taught us that the heaviest chains are the ones we wear inside our own minds, and that sometimes the key to freedom is as simple and as terrifying as wearing the clothes that make your soul sing. The king is dead. The court is dust. The laws have changed. But the image of the abbé, stepping into the pulpit with diamonds in his ears, remains, a sparkling, defiant question mark etched forever into the history of the human heart.